All right. All right. Okay, this should work.
Okay, cool. All right, we are all set then. Thanks, Swanand, for doing the talk. Swanand, most of you might be familiar with him. He's the ex-CTO of CoLearn, currently on a sabbatical, and he's agreed to give a talk on very important topic. Swanand, take it away.
Perfect. Hey everyone, Swanand here. As far as possible, please try to keep your videos on as a courtesy to everybody on the call, and we'll try to make this an open discussion. Project management is a very subjective topic, and so obviously there are lived experiences, opinions, etc. from everybody, especially the seniors. So I intend to keep it that way. However, there are a couple of things on the talk that I feel strongly about, and some of the principles I've derived over years of working as an IC, as a senior IC, as a leader, all of that. Right. So yeah, videos on. Let's try to have a discussion as far as possible, and let's dive into it. This talk is about principles of project management, and it's sort of my playbook for having effective work management at a workplace. It can potentially be expanded or extended into maybe personal life too, but that's on everybody. Like I don't use this for my personal life. I use it in my work life only at the moment. Cool. Also, the name of the talk is Principles of Project Management Flow, a hat tip to Donald Reinerson, whose work has influenced me in many different ways. This is one of his more famous books, Principles of Product Development Flow. Just like a show of hands, or drop a note if you have read the book. And if not, you should. It's a pretty amazing book. The book itself doesn't talk about project management, it's a completely different topic. But the style of writing and presenting a deeply researched matter speaks to me a lot. Anyway, so the title is a hat tip to Donald and his work. So who am I? I think some of you already know me. I see a bunch of familiar faces in the audience. I'm a free agent at the moment, sabbatical, break, consulting, all of those things. I used to be the CTO at CoLearn. I did that for about 3 years. And one neat little thing about me is that I have a track record of working on things before they become cool or before they become hot in the market. I worked on AI and ML 5-6 years ago at Remax. I was there for about 4 years. We ran machine learning models for the entire US population, and we went through a phase where our model used to take 24 hours to run. From there, we moved it to Spark, and then it started running in around 8 minutes. And all of this was like 7-8 years ago. Right, I worked on credit card tech, which is pretty hot right now, but I worked on it before it became hot 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and then I also worked in last mile logistics, route planning, all of that, around 10 years ago, when last mile was not even a commonly known word. So mostly I got lucky to be exposed to all of this work early. And then also remote has been like a theme in my life and my career. I've worked with all kinds of flavors of remote teams, distributed, asynchronous, synchronous, and everything in between. You can think of hybrid. All of that has been a big part of my life. This is mostly the work side. On my personal side, I like giving talks such as this, and I like to talk about engineering excellence, software cultures, slice of life, these kind of things. I don't blog too frequently, but I'm just in the middle of publishing a bunch of things on this particular website. Those of you who have been around and who have written some Java would probably be amused by the name. If you are, thumbs up to you. And if you know what the name or the sequence in the name means, then thumbs up to you. com.queries.fun. So enough about me. Let's dive into today's topic. It's based in two parts. Part one is principles. In this part, we're going to talk about what are the core driving principles behind sound and effective project management, and what are some things that you should intuitively understand. Right? These principles are something you want to understand and grok And then if you do, then you can devise or build your own system without a lot of effort. You don't have to really rely on how Jira does things, how Trello does things, how Basecamp does things. You can design your own work management system if you understand some of these principles really well. Of course, this does not apply to a large corporate who has 10,000 people and they want to manage all the 10,000 people's work, because that's a scaling problem. And again, like, this is designed to work in smaller teams. And the key thing to understand is, when you scale work management from, let's say, 5, 10, 15 people to like 100 people, you cannot meaningfully track all of their work in the same place. What you need to do is you need to distribute the number of places work management happens. And so the scale up is very similar to a horizontal scaling of a software system, where you hit a limit of vertical scaling. There's only so much latency and throughput one system can handle. And at that point, you're forced to redistribute horizontally. Project management systems on large scale are also similar. There comes a time when you hit the vertical limit pretty fast. And then after that point, it's about your org design, structure, etc., etc. And the reason I'm sharing this upfront is I did consult with a very large company with around 10,000 employees. The degree of separation between the individual IC and the CXO was around 25. So there are 25 levels in between the IC and the CTO. And they had to go through various different structures to actually get their project management right. So I'm just putting it up front. If somebody here is a part of like a big organization, these principles are not going to apply to your whole org, but they're going to apply to the local org or local team that you're part of. Anyway, and part 2 talks about the practicalities of applying these principles in life. And I'm going to pick Jira as an example because it happens to be the most used tool or platform. And so I chose Jira. But you can very well do the same thing in Basecamp or Trello or anything else. All right. So let's dive into the why part. Before that, I want to have like an audience poll, or I want to ask you some questions, right? I'll show you some photos and I want you to tell me what activity is this. And Shiva, if you can just read out some of the answers for me, I would appreciate that. So what activity is this? Anybody?
You have lawn mowing, grooming,
Lawn mowing. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Somebody got it. So it's lawn mowing, of course, right? What about this? And anybody, feel free to unmute and speak also. Like, there's no restriction. What activity? What does this look like?
See, puzzle solving, jigsaw
puzzles.
puzzle,
That's right. So jigsaw puzzles. Beautiful. What about this? What does this look like?
Cleaning arrangement, rearranging.
Rearranging. Yes. Any other words?
Moving out of a house or a moving in kind of thing.
Yeah. So let me give you a hint. Does this help? Do you know who this is? This is Marie Kondo. So that was tidying up. Okay. One last. What does this look like?
Grocery shopping.
Grocery shopping, right? Groceries. Perfect. So now some of these activities are not like the others. Right? They're a little bit different. So I want to ask you 2 questions with regards to these 4 activities. We saw lawn mowing, jigsaw puzzles, grocery shopping, and tidying up. Now, try to answer these 2 questions in the context of these 4 activities. Are you done? And then how much is done? Right? And if you start thinking about these 2 questions about those 4 activities, what sort of comes to, or what is revealed, is that lawn mowing and jigsaw puzzles are somewhat similar, and tidying up and grocery shopping is somewhat similar. And the reason is that with lawn mowing, you don't really need to tell anybody how much you're done. Somebody looks at your lawn and they're going to know that you're like 75% done. 25% is left. You don't need to tell them, hey, I'm done with lawn mowing. You already know that it's happening. It's quite clear as day. Same with jigsaw puzzle. When you solve a puzzle, nobody needs to tell you whether the puzzle is done or not. Right? It's in front of you, clear. And even if you're like missing a few pieces in a jigsaw puzzle, it's pretty straightforward to know that, hey, these pieces are missing and whatnot. Whereas tidying up and grocery shopping are the opposite. It's never clear when you're done. You don't know how much is really left. My definition of tidied up room is different from, let's say, my partner's definition of tidying up. Grocery shopping, like multiple things need to happen in parallel. You went with a list of things in mind, but you ended up buying 5 other things and you did not find something. There was no replacement, etc. So you don't really know when you're done. You don't really know how much is left. It's a little bit of a mess in terms of that, right? So, and that's the key to effective work management. Those 2 questions. And now extend this metaphor to some work or life-related tasks. For example, writing a long-form blog post, right? You need to do research, etc. You need to write, you need to draft, edit, hiring 5 members for your team, fundraising, writing a novel, getting a PhD. Some of these are like short, some of these are long-term activities, long-term work, long-term projects, all of that. And then again, think about those 2 questions: are you done, and how much is left, or how much is done, right? Or if you want to sort of come back even more, like work-related things. So things like, retarget users on WhatsApp. You have a bunch of MAUs, and then someone are churned, and you want to retarget them. So you want to write a campaign, you want to write whatever code, build something, craft a trial and paid event schedule, increase retention by X%, right? Mute bad words in uploaded videos, e-receipts for your POS customers, etc. Right? I'm sure like you've seen some of these works. Like in fact, the first 4 are actual epics and actual pieces of work from my CoLearn days. These are the actual pieces of work that we've done, right? So now same thing. Are you done? How much is done? And then finally, collaboration needed. Barely any of these activities are to be done solo. Right? Solo is not the name of the game here. Of course, if you're like an indie developer and working in slinging product and engineering and everything all by yourself, you're doing solo, and then the amount of overhead collaboration you need is very little. But majority of the work that happens in the world is not solo. Majority of the work that we saw earlier in targeting order involves multiple parties. They need to collaborate, they need to let each other know, they need to escalate the right time. All of those things need to happen. And all of that involves some level of work management and system. If not, things go out of control very fast. I'm sure people here have experienced a project or work that was not managed properly. And then I'm hoping that some of you have had an experience where somebody was taking the time to manage the work properly, and then things rolled smoothly, right? I've worked with such people. I worked on teams where the work was managed effortlessly, and it just cleared up so much headspace for me that I'm in the category of being forever grateful to people who took that effort when I was working. And then there have been times when I have taken the effort to make sure that others have that same experience. There are a couple of principles or patterns that stand out from this discussion that we've had so far. Number 1 is obviously work is complex with many to-dos, right? There are different things to do. They all take different times, right? Different things at different times. Buying, let's say, vegetables is very different from just buying, like, say, sugar. You know your brand of sugar. You buying sugar is basically just figuring out, 1 kg sugar taken from the shelf and put it in my cart. But vegetables is that you need to go look at the vegetables. Are they fresh, not fresh, etc. Then multiple decision making. And this is again a very small example. If you extend that metaphor again to work life, different things take different times. Very intuitive. Multiple people always need to do things in parallel, right? Design is happening, whatever styling is happening, UX research is happening, back end, front end are working in parallel, all those things, right? Documentation, different things can happen in parallel. And then different things can also actually happen or need to happen sequentially. Something must be done first before something else can happen. So there is a whole complex maze of things that need to be navigated. And this is the reality of work. Every single piece of work that you are in charge of at work has some or all these flavors, right? Different things at different times, multiple to-dos, different things to do, sequential and parallel in nature. So now, given that I've shared some of these things, a little bit of show of hands, I'm going to explain a situation and then raise your hand if you felt like that or if you have been in a situation like that, right? So, for example, you felt like there were too many things on your mind, right? Show of hands. Anybody? Right? I mean, at this point, it's a wonder if you haven't felt like this. Right? Obviously, we identify with this strongly. Sometimes you're sort of in the zone and then you really work at 10x your normal, right? You're in the zone. And your productivity is just 10 times your normal productivity. Right? Anybody experience this? Like I have it all the time, right? Cool. Any interest? If you want to share a comment or something, feel free to drop it in the chat. You felt like you really needed help on something. You're doing something, but you just did not understand some piece, or you did not know how to do it, or you really needed help. Right? Anybody felt like that? I did. Like just yesterday, I was working on a SOC 2 compliance for one of the teams I'm consulting with, and there was a piece which I had no idea, right? And so yeah, show of hands if you felt like that. And again, like just keep coming back to these three questions. What are you working on? When will this be done? Where are we with these? Are you faced with a manager or leader who asks you these questions? Right? Yeah. Anybody has a manager who never asked these questions? Well, I'm sure there's a bunch of you who feel like this, and you have managers or leaders, peers who keep asking you these questions. One more thing, like you have too many things to do. You know that there are, like, let's say 8 things on your plate you want to do, but you really struggle to just pick one and roll with it, right? Which one? I don't know. Analysis, paralysis, whatever. Anybody feel like that? Well, I can't see your chat and I can't hear you, so I'll assume you do. Like I said, this talk is intended to be conversational, so don't just chat away, unmute and speak if you had to, right? And then, this is far too common with engineers. You are working on something, and then but something else came up, and now the other thing has occupied your headspace, attention, and you're not working on the original thing that you're working on anyway. Anybody experience this? I'm pretty sure you have, right? All of these are like far too common. They happen all the time. Or one more thing, this list seems endless. Have I missed something? I need an extra set of eyes. You need this PR reviews, etc. Sometimes you already have a review, but you've done a self review, but you still want another pair of eyes. You know there is something missing. You don't know, and you want someone else to come and take a look. You're not alone, obviously, as you can see by the chat and show of hands and whatnot. You're not alone. Everybody faces these all the time. These situations are far too common, and the fix is not that difficult. So what are the different solutions that have been tried, and what are common solutions that we use? The first and the most common solution is to-do list. This is something we are driven to, and we maintain to-do lists all the time. Anybody here who manages their entire work with to-dos, personal work? And again, I think I would prefer if you can quick unmute and speak in 1 or 2 sentences. Anybody big fan of to-do lists?
I have tried, but initially I have tried to do it and done it for a few days, but eventually, I lost the track of it. Then
Lost
again,
the track. Can you share your name? I totally because I can't see you.
yeah, my name is Atish.
Atish. Okay, Atish. All right. Cool. So Atish has tried. Thanks for sharing, Atish. To-do lists do work to some extent, exactly like Atish said, but they have a couple of faults. And there are 2 main problems with to-do list. Number one, usually any list that you make, it's a single list by definition, and so there's less freedom. There's only the degrees of freedom is only up and down, or the structure of a to-do list is actually very restrictive. So there's a single list, right? And you can move only things up and down. And then finally, there are only 2 states, pending or done. Like, it's difficult to represent more states in a to-do list in an effective. Of course, you could use things like emojis and whatnot to specify, okay, this task is like pending review, whatnot. But it's not intuitive, not hard, not easy to maintain it. It falls off the wagon pretty fast. And so generally speaking, you will have like a box, and then you will check off the box as you're done, or cross out as you're done. So two states, pending and done. And if you connect these two problems with the other problem that we've seen before about work being complex, multiple eyes, sequential, parallel, the conclusion is that it's not enough. To-do lists are not enough to manage work effectively. Specifically, when you start talking about work and work management, they're not enough. Even though you create like topical lists and stuff like that, they just don't seem to get the job done. And this is where boards were invented. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history of like the Kanban board or Jira board. Trello was one of the first products, as far as I know, who introduced boards. They've been used in corporate and other war rooms before, but boards solve a very specific set of problems, and we're going to look into each of them right now. One is like they're able to help you offload your brain in a way. You can batch your work with the concept of boards. Okay, what do I mean by boards? Board is like a vertically stacked arrangement, the same thing that you're familiar with the concept that any column can be hidden or shown as required. So the columns can be permanent and columns can be transient. So let's say you keep things, moving things to done column. At some point, the column become big, you can archive it, move it across the board and whatnot. So there are columns of work or columns of things, and then some of them can be permanent and some of them can be transient. And the whole thing is horizontally and vertically stacked up. So you have two-dimensional structure. That's what a board is. For those who might have used it but don't know the formal or don't know how to articulate what a board is, this is the core definition of a board. They allow you to batch your work in, then you can collaborate on tasks, one of the problems that we've seen earlier. The one look update is very much possible with a board because of that horizontal and left to right and top to bottom structure. And then there is certain level of clarity looking ahead and retrospective possible on a board. You have the done column on the right, you have the to-do list on the left, etc. Right, and then they do allow you to capture incoming work better because it gives you a perspective of what is currently in progress, what is done, and so capturing of incoming work is handled a little bit better. And then obviously a second set of eyes, review columns, etc. Boards make it natural to add a second set of eyes. Of course, to-do lists can give you some of the other things, but you have to stack a lot of structure on top of to-do lists to actually make many of these things happen. Whereas when you're using boards, it happens naturally, and I'll explain why naturally in just a little bit. Right. So the big question is, how does all of this happen? So now I'm going to talk about 6 principles, and following these 6 principles makes all of those things happen. So the first principle is literally what it says on the screen: track all the work, like every single piece of work that needs to be done. Track it. Like, don't hesitate. Every single task that should be done should be put on a board. This is key. Notice that I did not say that it has to be put on the board before you do the work. Sometimes you just want to get something done, but then once you're done, you want to come back and add a column or add an entry on your board. If you are doing something that just you're in the zone, you want to get things done, get them done, but then document it. And this part is extremely important. Your brain needs to be trained to think that everything that needs to be done about this particular context is on this board. It's present here. You have not missed anything. And that belief needs to be developed and trained. And that can only happen if nothing gets dropped and everything gets captured as a habit. This is one of the core getting things done principle as well. The book GTD talks about some of these, actually this particular thing in detail. So your brain, like our brains, need some time to develop this kind of trust in the system. And if you keep, let's say you're in a group and you keep telling each other that put everything on the board, over time, and this time varies for every team, depending on how much trust they have in each other and their systems. Over time, you come to rely on that particular board where all the work is here. You haven't missed anything, right? When I used to run teams, I used to ask a question to my team. Is there anybody from CoLearn here, or anybody who has worked with me? If anybody, unmute and speak if you're present. But if not, hey, who is this?
Kamakshi.
Oh, hey, Kamakshi. Kamakshi, do you remember the question I used to ask about Jira boards on the stand-ups? Yeah. Anyway, like no big suspense. The question I used to ask is this: is the Jira board an accurate representation of all work, right? And I used to ask this every stand-up until at some point people started asking me, Swanand, like, yeah, just be done with it. Like, yes, it is. Before even I would ask questions, people would say, okay, done. So your Jira board, or I mean, we use Jira, so I used to ask about Jira. But your Kanban board has to be an accurate representation of all the work that is done in the current context, pending, blocked, to do all of that. And when this happens, you start developing that belief and you start tracking work. So that's the first principle: track all the work, document every single task that needs to be done. All clear? Anybody has any comments or questions that they want to share? If not, let's move to the second one. Start with 4 simple lists. No need to overcomplicate things. A lot of the templates give you like 5, 6 different lists. You don't need them. You can evolve. Start with only 4. To do, doing, review, and done. That's it. To do is on your left, doing, review, and then done, left to right. All your work and everything that we spoke about so far can be done mostly using these 4 lists, right? This is all you need to begin with. And this is all that you need until your system becomes a little more complex. Sometimes, if you work with a lot of external dependencies, such as third-party integrations, updates, and stuff like that, you may need other columns like blocked, etc. But before you get there, start with 4 simple lists: to do, doing, review, and then done. When you work and when you review the work, this is the order you need to work in. Work right to left and top to bottom. Right to left, if you go back to this, right to left is you look at the done things and figure out if there's anything new done. Then whatever is pending review, you come to that first, then go to doing, that work in progress, and then finally to do, which is the work that you're going to do. So the principle is right to left, top to bottom. I'm assuming you work in a left to right language, this is English. If you are in a right to left language, then this will be flipped. So let's say Arabic. If you're working primarily in Arabic, then this would be left to right. But for English speaking countries, right to left, top to bottom. Always finish like ongoing work first, and then prioritize reviewing and unblocking the others, right? So if your work or something is dependent on others, then that takes precedence. So then the teammates can pursue their own work independently. And then the top to bottom is a visual priority order. One of the key things of this principle, when you look at the pile of work or stack of work, it should be immediately clear what needs to be worked on first, and that's the top of the list, right? So right to left, unblocking and reviewing work first, then your own work, and then top to bottom in the priority order. Now the person who maintains this board, usually the leader or the leadership of the team, could be PM, EM, TPM, whatever. It's their job to maintain this priority order, right? The team has to agree that top to bottom is the priority order, and then one person or a group of people are in charge of maintaining that priority order always, right? Nobody has to ever deal with the ambiguity of what to work on next. You're done, pick the topmost thing on the list that you can work on and start working on it. Because then you don't need to ask anybody to, hey, can you pick this up? Or nobody needs to ask you, hey, can I pick this up, right? It's already agreed on, priorities written, you just start working. Next up, number 4, divide the work into tasks of 1 to 2 days max, right? And I'll come and I'll share a little bit about why 1 to 2 days. But Basically, if anything is larger than that, split into smaller chunks. And this needs a lot of upfront thinking, right? You do need to, if a work is complex enough, that cannot happen in, let's say, 2 days. And let's face it, most of the critical work that we do cannot happen in like 1 or 2 days. It does take more time. Sometimes you just need to let it sit for a while and whatnot. So it does need planning work into these 1 to 2 days chunk. Needs a little bit of upfront thinking, right? Like they say, weeks of working can save you hours of planning. What that means is sometimes this upfront thinking and planning activity is actually quite challenging, and it can be pretty daunting, and we end up avoiding it because it's tedious and can be difficult, and there's room for error. One famous example is work estimates, right? Developers world over are really reluctant to come up with estimates. For one, estimates are really hard to come up with, and then second, they are held to that arbitrary estimate or seemingly arbitrary estimate that they come up with. So there are other cultural problems associated with that. I'm not going to get into those, but my idea is the upfront thinking can be daunting, but just by engaging in that level of upfront thinking allows you to have a much smoother flow of work afterwards. Again, it does help with estimates, timelines, etc. Right? And then if the work or things that you're tracking is smaller than 1 to 2 days, like a couple of hours, like a few minutes and whatnot, putting it on a card and putting it on the main board, etc., just adds a lot of busy work to the team. And it's not fun to see a sea of cards in front of you when you open your thing. It helps to have a clear, concise board with deliverable work. And so if you have smaller work, you can roll it up into a batch, contextual batch, and roll it up into like a user story or task or something, and do it as a part of that. Again, all of that needs a little bit of planning, and that is exactly the job of like an engineering manager or product manager. Their job is to make sense of the work ahead of the team and break it into meaningful pieces that then the team can engage in. If you fundamentally look at software engineering or software development, it's a very heads down profession, right? Once you have figured out what needs to be done, and then you have a little bit of idea of how it's going to be done, then your job is to just put your head down and get to work. And then when you are in that heads down mode, it's not pretty to sort of keep coming back up and again and again, right? And so this is where that hit needs to be taken by the leadership. Make no mistake, like the engineering managers and product managers cannot afford to have hours and hours of focus the way the team does. They need to balance their deep work, focus work timing, thinking timing, and getting the team unblocked and keeping all of this work management on track. And sometimes what ends up happening is teams, specifically larger and more corporate teams, end up hiring like TPMs and project managers who are dedicated for this kind of task. Like I'm neutral to that. Like, I've worked in teams where there were TPMs and worked without as well. Like, I don't really have opinion on one side or the other. Whatever works for you, you should do it. But anyway, back to our principle. Number 4 is keep the work into tasks of 1 to 2 days max. And with software engineering, it's almost always possible, right? I'm talking about, let's say, the P95 variety of work. If you're building like a multi-pass compiler with continuation passing and closures and whatnot, I mean, you're going to run into some work that cannot be finished in a day or two. It's like weeks of work at time. And I'm not talking about that kind of work. I'm specifically talking about you're building apps, features, dashboards, everyday engineering work, sort of, right? What a SaaS company might do. So I'm specifically not talking about research work here. Research work famously, obviously, has way longer timelines, and that's not what's being talked about here. Number 5, the why of anything matters the most than the what, and then the how matters the least. This is again the actual content of the work or the description of the work. Start your cards with why, like why are we doing something, and provide that context. Because assuming that you have a team that is aligned and capable and competent, if they understand why we are doing something, they are going to be able to take decisions without blocking or unblocking, without blocking anyone else. Everybody needs to be able to take decisions, and then if the why is clear, you want people to be able to go ahead and unblock themselves, right? And it also helps to understand something or the decision that was taken. Let's say there is a Figma screen and it has like a bottom sheet for selecting something. Now, if you're an Android engineer and you've done that multiple times, you know that maybe there's some problem with the bottom sheet on, say, Flutter. So you're wondering like, hey, should I do something else instead? And then if the why is explained, like if this is like a UI item, it does not need to take the attention away, stuff like that. If the context and the why is explained properly, you can make a judgment call whether you want to do the exact same thing that described, or you want to change the decision, let other people know that, hey, I changed this because whatever, right? So that why becomes important. And then obviously you also want to add what. You don't want people to constantly keep figuring out what to do. You want to add it as much as possible. You want to add that what to do, right? If you don't do this, what happens if you don't share the why, you don't share the context, you run the risk of your teams or you becoming like a Jira card pusher who just keeps on taking the work from the top of the file and just finishing the work. And you don't want a team to become like Jira card pushers. You want them to build something meaningful. You want them to have a meaningful time. You want people to grow in their career. You want to build something amazing for the users. And no Jira card pusher team builds something amazing, right? And if they do, it's accidental. Anyway, number 6, describe the finish line, right? Not the route. And this is again as important as the why. The done part is essential. What do you mean by finish or done? What does it look like when this piece of work is finished and is successful? If you're talking about, let's say, retargeting, then talking about the campaign numbers, number of reads, number of opens, number of clicks, all of that funnel. If you describe that finish line, hey, this is what it looks like when this work is done, then it's easy to test, easy to check. You will help your QA teams. You can write acceptance criteria, and you can make reusable pieces of work. All of those things become easy. So the definition of done is essential in any team. When you move a card to done column, the whole team needs to understand, okay, it's moved to done. That means something. In some teams, it means nobody needs to look at it anymore. In some teams, it means someone else is going to look at it, or it needs to go in a report or something, right? So that the definition of done is a little bit, there's a delta. About 80% of the definition is common, and then the rest 20% is like up to each team to figure out what their definition is. But what is more important is that everybody agrees on this is what done means, right? And then obviously from time to time, some people are going to make mistakes. They'll move to done when they did not really mean it done. And you can fix those. You can add like checks, you can do pair programming, add balances, all of those things to make sure that everybody understands what done means. And that starts at describing the finish line clearly in the work description. Right? So context and finish lines. And in general, don't write how to do this on the card. This is it's very tempting to actually do this, specifically for competent and senior people who already have done this multiple times. It's so easy to just describe, hey, do this. Hey, you're trying to describe like a new authentication system. Oh yeah, look at this doc, then add this controller, add this view, add this redirect, create this event record and do it, right? Super tempting to write all of this. And maybe if you're really training somebody in the early days, you might want to write some of these things. But I recommend adding like a separate section for like notes or dev notes and capturing some of these things there. As far as possible, avoid being very prescriptive on how to do something, because that leaves out room for thinking. If you are looking at a card someone else wrote, and then they've already taken the time to think about how to do it, you're not going to think much about it, right? And remember, if you're an engineer, QA engineer, software engineer, developer, mobile, you are paid to think and deliver outcomes. You're not paid to write code. Of course, writing code is part of our jobs, but the reason you are paid and paid well is because you're a thinker. And so just constantly having a super prescriptive approach on how to do this starts training people to not think. Like doing it on one card is not going to change anybody's behavior, right? I understand that. But if you keep doing it, it's going to train people to not think. And you never want to be in a position where people are just mindlessly doing work. Never ever. All right, so these are the 6 principles. I'm going to quickly recap. Any questions, any experiences, anything anyone want to share?
Yes, Swanand, I have a question. Atish here.
Atish. Yes, Atish.
So firstly, thanks for this wonderful presentation and your guidelines. So thanks for this. So I have a question regarding my day-to-day work. So I'm in a position where, I deal with a lot of stakeholders.
Okay.
So now for every stakeholder's requirement, as per that stakeholder, his requirement is the topmost priority, right?
Okay. Could be. Is that the agreement you have between them? Like, do
No,
you have a
so
company
the thing
playbook
is,
where?
no, so the thing is sometimes these could be stakeholders from completely two different business paradigms working on the same product, but they are
Right.
not in sync with each other.
Sure.
So
Sure.
this business guy, as per him, his requirement is the topmost priority. As per the other business analyst guy, his requirement is the topmost priority. So now,
Okay.
as someone who is the person in charge, how do I decide to which things should be worked on the higher priority?
Okay. All right. Let me address. So there are two parts to your question. One is about having a system where you have to report and uh, expose or share different types of update, different domains of updates. That's part one. Part two is the politics of it. The politics I'll avoid at the moment. Like we can maybe have a one-on-one chat after this. The part where you said both leaders are giving you conflicting directions. If you have a single place, see, here's the thing: even though you have two different leaders, there is only one business, and the work that is aligned with the business is a single piece of work, right? The metrics that you're tracking, they go and they're aligned with the business. If you have a Jira board or analytics or reports tool that tracks about or tracks and talks about business metrics, you can create that centralized report and share with both of them. And to make their jobs easy, you can highlight things that are relevant to each of them, right? This is about post work. This is about giving the updates and bringing everybody on the same page during and after the work. Before picking up work, the priority cannot be ambiguous, right? The priority has to be completely unambiguous. And if you're getting conflicting directions there, what you can do is try to bring them in the same room, same board, do it asynchronously. You don't have to get into a meeting and whatnot, but you cannot do this opaquely. Right? If let's say the product manager and the engineering manager are giving you different directions, different priorities, then you have to sort of escalate and bubble this up to both of them, and only then proceed. Generally speaking, a political principle is do what your reporting manager asks you to do. This is the samest and the lowest friction approach. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the right approach, but it's the lowest friction approach to go with whoever is writing your salary, paying your salary, or whoever controls your work. You can align your priority actions with them, but don't do it without bubbling the conflict up. Because if there's a conflict, then there is a reason behind that conflict, and then that can be harming in the longer term. So you want to bubble the conflict up.
Okay. Thanks a
Cool.
lot. Thanks a lot.
All right. I'm happy to chat maybe one-on-one a little bit after this.
Sure. That
Cool.
would be
For
great.
everyone else, just recapping the 6 principles, they're on the screen. I'm sure you already scanned them. But yeah, I just repeat them because they're that important. Track all the work. Start with 4 lists: to do, doing, review, and done. You can expand to things like blocked and whatnot later. The one thing I've failed to share here is that a lot of, let me go back to this in fact. A lot of the engineering teams tend to have like a PR review kind of list. PR review, code written pending PR review, and they create a lane and then move tasks to PR review. What I call that? I call it throwing shit over the wall and hoping someone else catches it. Because until the piece of code that you have written is deployed, merged, and whatever deployment cycle your company follows, it's your responsibility. So if you create a separate lane for just tracking reviews and whatnot, that sets you up for this whole throwing shit over the wall approach. You have to own, basically there's a single owner. Every piece of work has a single owner. And that ownership is remained or it's maintained constant when it goes through all these to do, doing, review, and cycle. My recommendation: do not ever create a pending code review or pending QA sort of a cycle. if let's say QA teams and engineering or coding teams are working on the same board, you can create alternate views to help the QA teams maintain a list of items that they have to review, but never ever sign something like, oh, I have done my job, now it's on to the QA team, and I'll just wait until they're done. Don't do this. If you can potentially add like a block column or something and say it's blocked until let's say the QA signs off, but it remains your responsibility until it moves to done. Never do ping pong with the, basically once you sign up for a work, it should never ideally be assigned to someone else. The only condition where the work gets assigned to someone else is when you're not going to do it anymore, right? So that's one of my process tips. This is the one part where most anti-patterns are prevalent, and I see like teams all over the world make a mistake with this. Is there anybody here who does these two things? If you do, like my recommendation, just retrospect a little bit and keep ownership. Like whoever is working on it, they maintain the ownership of it, right? Done, and again, the definition of done plays a big role here. You maintain the ownership of something until it's done. In CoLearn, for example, for a particular project, the ownership remained with the developers until the metrics for that particular feature or work showed up on Mixpanel, right? Once Mixpanel starts tracking that particular metric, then it went out of their hands and into someone else's hands. Until then, it was with the developers, and that part was super successful. Like we had a lot of success implementing that. Anyway, just recapping the 6 lists. Work, so to do, doing, review, done, and then expand as you needed. Work from right to left and top to bottom. Divide the work into 1 to 2 day chunks. Avoid over or bigger tasks. Avoid smaller tasks so that busy work does not come in. Focus on why and context. When writing cards, like write something like finish line and context, and then finally describe the finish line, not the route. Any comments, any other questions, anything I can share?
Hi, Swanand. Sai Prasad here.
Hey Sai. Yes.
Swanand, I had one specific question to point number 5, the why, what, and how.
Okay.
Usually, the whys sit in something called like an ADR, an architecture decision record. The whats and the hows may be on your Jira, GitHub, wherever necessary. Is it necessary that these need to be consolidated in a single place? What is your opinion around these?
Yeah, so great question. ADRs are usually about like much larger pieces. Like if you're migrating from Mongo to Postgres, or like you're adding a new foreign key instead of like turning an existing column in a foreign key. Things like that are what are ADR material. Every decision does not, every smaller decision does not need to be backed by an ADR. I mean, in fact, ADR stands for architectural decision records, right? And then the architecture can be like software architecture or information architecture, product architecture, etc. The reason I strongly recommend keeping the why on the card is this, connecting it back to the ownership principle, right? When you have the ownership of, let's say, a piece of work, let's call it card in this case, that having all of those 3 things always in the context is important. This is how you do like holistic work. You own the task, you own the feature, user story, whatever, and that why, what, and how it stays with you until it goes to done, and then it's out of your mind. Which is why I recommend keeping that. I don't like, for example, I don't recommend having detailed PRDs in the card itself. Usually they're linked, but if there's like a relevant decision on why we're doing this, etc., it could be part of the different document that is linked here. But you want to create a hierarchy with your why part. Maybe there's a user, a complete feature or a complete or a product that you're building. Let's say if you're building a feature and this user stories that you're working on is a part of that feature, there'll obviously be like a high level record of why we're doing this, but there'll also be like a reason of why this card exists, and why are we doing this particular thing. Like let's say there is a card which says like you need to do some Swagger API for a endpoint, then you want to write why do we need that API, who's the consumer of that API, etc. So which is different from the high level task of why we're doing the whole thing in the first place, right? So that's the hierarchy of whys. Does it answer your question? Yeah.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Anand, there are a few questions in chat.
Okay.
Let me just read them out. Hold on one second.
All right.
So one question was, oftentimes in initiatives we have to deal with unknowns, like which third-party vendor to go with, etc. How will the implementation take place? How do we effectively estimate this? That was one of the
Okay.
questions.
Yeah. So this is common enough. This kind of work. So when this kind of work comes in, I usually divide it in two phases. Phase one is when there is ambiguity. So the phase one is about discovery and writing throwaway code, reading documentation, creating documentation, etc. That's the phase one. So I create like pieces of work to just get to the clarity zone. That's your part one of the work. And that include, if you're talking to vendors and all, that include like vendor research, that includes like reading documentation, that includes like maybe downloading their Postman collection and playing out with the API, etc., etc. And then at some point the clarity sort of crosses a barrier where you now know how and what to go about. All right. And so I generally divide that kind of work, vendors, integrations, into these two phases. Phase one is very commonly known as a spike, right? I'm spiking into, let's say I'm working on Jira and I want to integrate with Refinitiv. There's a stock exchange-based service that I'm actually currently working with. And so I'm not familiar with the Refinitiv API and I don't know how it plays into the thing that I'm currently working on. So I would create a spike card that says, okay, figure out the whole thing and get some clarity. And then at that point, you are ready to craft a requirement or craft a one-pager or whatnot about this particular work. So that's my approach. It has served me really well. If anyone else, any other seniors want to share their approach in the comments, feel free to drop an answer. Does that answer the question? I guess it does. Shiva, can you read out some of the other questions? Then I'll. In fact, you know what? Let me quickly look at the chat. It's a whole bunch of things. Oh yeah. So I will be going to Jira. So we've done with part one right now. Part two, I am going. I know we are almost out of time, but I'll take 20 more minutes to go through actual Jira and all that. Sparks Joy. Okay. Back to. So this is good. Are we seeing the 6 principles right now on the screen? Okay, cool. So recap, always think of long moving jigsaw puzzles versus tidying up in grocery shopping. If you really want to ambiguate or disambiguate between work, one is visually evident. You never have to know how much is done, how much is not done. It's clear. And you always want your project management to be like that, to be more like lawn mowing, more like jigsaw puzzle, and less like tidying up and less like grocery shopping. Cool. So we already covered questions. Now let's go into practicals of how to actually go about it in, let's say, Jira. There's a whole bunch of options, linear, Asana, Shortcut. Shortcut, by the way, one of my top favorite tool. It used to be called Clubhouse before. Then they later renamed to Shortcut because there was another software popular with the name Clubhouse. Basecamp, like extremely polarizing piece of software. There are people who love it and cannot do without. People who outright just hate it, etc. Right? Everybody who has used Basecamp has a strong opinion whether or not Basecamp is good. Half of them are going to completely trash it. Half are going to love it. In any Basecamp lovers here? Yeah. All right, Shortcut lovers. Okay, cool. So Jira. All right. Anybody has any strong opinions? Feel free to drop them in the chat. So for now, we're going to use Jira. Again, it's a facepalm moment. Again, I have like a love-hate relationship with Jira. Honestly, I love the software because it solves so many problems in the least bad way possible. And specifically, if you have larger teams, 80, 90, 100, 200, none of these other tools can truly manage it that easily the way that Jira can. And if you need a lot of control and customization, some teams do on their workflow, their automation, etc. Jira does it like the best, right? And then obviously there's a subset of Jira. They now call it team managed process that takes like all of those things, makes them less configurable, less decisions to make, and makes it simple. So for the purposes of project management, if you're in the situation where you want to choose a tool, you will not go wrong with Jira in a team managed project. If you really have people who are Jira experts, you can pick like the Jira company managed project and like have at it. But the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit in terms of Jira, but don't again don't despair if you've never used it or used something else. Almost everything that I'm going to talk about can be done in other softwares as well, right? So we are not really locked down to Jira. I'm just using them as an illustrative example. Some tools of the trade. At this point, I want to just quickly ask the room whether is there anybody who has absolutely no idea what these terms means or any of these terms, right? You don't have to like. Is there anyone who does not understand any of these terms? Subtask, tasks, user stories, epics, projects, sprints, statuses, labels, swim lanes. Perhaps swim lanes is the least known amongst all of these 9. All right. Let's assume that most of you know most of these, right? Is there anybody who doesn't understand any of this? I doubt. All right. Time has passed. You lost your chance. Now pay attention. So task is basically something, work that needs to be tracked, something that needs to be done and tracked. It's typically not user facing. And again, no more than a few days. 1 to 2 is the best, as we saw earlier. It could be a little bit smaller too. Something that needs to be done and something that needs to be tracked should be here. It's called a task. One example from, again, my CoLearn days. Enable 2FA on AWS for, one of our account. It's part of the security fixes May to July epic. And then there's a label called infrastructure on it. And then there's like a name. It's assigned to somebody named SM. So this is an example of a task, not really user facing, but it needs to be tracked and done, and it needs to be part of a report and whatnot. So those tasks, I'm going to go through these a little bit fast because some of the things that I want to talk about, more interesting things, are a little bit towards the end. So let me go through these a little bit fast. Subtasks, again, work that doesn't need to be independently tracked. And here's the key thing. If you have subtasks, either Jira, Trello, Basecamp, wherever, don't let them show up on your main board. They just pollute the board to an extent where it just becomes noisy. Don't track them independently. Don't let them show up on the main board. It should be a part of some other task which is on the board. And they are completely at the discretion of the task owner, whoever is owning, 1 or 2 people, whatever. These subtasks are at their discretion. They are free to create and update subtasks as they choose. And I say owners here. I know many teams have this concept of single ownership, and it's a valid principle. But I have done pairing practically all my life. And in CoLearn, we used to assign like every user story and task to 2 people because we did pair programming quite a bit. And the golden rule for subtask is it should never be greater than 1 day. If you end up writing a subtask that is like more than a day, then there's something wrong in your overall plan, and you want to go back to your tasks or user stories and figure things out. All right. So this again connects back to our 6 principles: divide your work into 1 to 2 day chunks. So tasks and subtasks are about that. Now, user story, again, shining star of the project management stories is user story. I'm sure all of you, or most of you, are familiar. User-facing work, independently verifiable, and this is the primary unit of work. The 2 most important aspects of any user story are it has to be user-facing work. There has to be a user that is going to experience this work when the work is done. And then each user story has to be independently verifiable. This is absolutely critical. If a piece of work is not independently verifiable, it's rubbish and should not be on the board. Every board or every work that is being tracked from left to right has to be independently verifiable. If you have a task like that's like write an API documentation or something, it has to be verifiable by someone else, right? Or yourself 3 months later, 1 week later, 1 day later. So independently verifiable user-facing work is what a user story typically means. And mostly in software development world, this is the primary unit of work. Right? Most of the work happens in user stories because somebody is using the software that we are writing. And again, an example of a user story from our like old board. It says very clearly, inform parent about app registration, right? And then the epic is parent onboarding, etc. Right? This is like a clearly defined user story when you open the card, there are like a bunch of other details, the why and the finish line. What does it look like when the parents are informed about app registration, etc. Notice that I did not use flowery language, and I'll talk about that a little bit. If you are in doubt whether should you create a task or should you create a user story, create a user story. Just pick a default. My suggestion is let user story be the default. This enables a user-centric thinking, right? Always thinking of work in terms of user story brings a user-centric thinking into work, which otherwise is a little bit difficult to bring in. Product engineering is about caring for the product and the end user and the user experience. Whether that end user is your customer or admin team or finance team or someone else, a user-centric thinking is always useful, right? Always effective. And thinking in terms of user stories brings that user-centric thinking into work. And which is why I always recommend to go with user stories. However, consider this user story, right? As a student, I want a gentle reminder, or I want to get a reminder before a class so that I will not miss the class. Anybody familiar with this format of user stories? I'm sure many people are. Here's the thing. If you really remove the noise, students should get a reminder before the class so that they don't miss the class, right? So that format of as a student, whatnot, the main thing of all of those things is that the why and the context matter here, right? The context is that there is a class happening and they need a reminder before the class, and the finish line is that they don't miss the class, right? And this is important. Like you're sending the reminder because they don't want to miss the class. They don't miss the class. So you do everything you can as a part of the product team to make sure that they don't miss the class. Which means that if you really want to take a different decision on helping them not miss the class, you can do it. You have the authority to take a different decision based on the outcome that is described, right? But compare the same thing to something like send a reminder to students 5 minutes before the class, right? It's cleaner, it's simpler, easier to understand, easier to write. Nobody has to remember the format. That whole, as a student, I want to, so that I don't like that format of news stories. Like I think it's crap and I don't really use it. I don't recommend that you use this flowery language. I recommend that you just write a simple, straightforward description of what the user experience is. Right? Send a reminder to students 5 minutes before class. This makes it clear that this is about the students, about the class, and it adds all the details. It conveys all the information and more without having that needless syntax around it. Then epics, again, fairly commonly used. Larger body of work, usually a project deliverable is called an epic. It needs multiple user stories to actually finish, and it should have a start and end date. This is the part that is missed the most. We create epics all the time, but we do not give them start and end date. And then that is one of the core mistakes as per the GTD principle as well. Epic must be a finishable piece of work, and every finishable piece of work should have like a start and end date. And that end date can change as and when the work progresses and you have updates and whatnot, that can change. Or sometimes the end date is immovable. Let's say you're scaling up the WhatsApp infrastructure to handle Happy Diwali messages, and Diwali falls on, let's say, 4th of November. You have a deadline that cannot be moved. And so that epic needs to be finished well before that deadline. So it's an immovable deadline. So sometimes there are immovable deadlines involved. Like in CoLearn, for example, we had these semester start dates. If you're releasing a major chunk of work, it has to finish before that semester start date. You cannot move the semester start date. The school semester starts on July 4. That means it's going to start on July 4. If you're doing something, it has to finish before that. And so if there's an epic that is involved with, let's say, some piece of work that is about the semester start, then there's a deadline, and then it needs to be met. And so those kind of dates need to be conveyed and added to the epic. One example, again, student reports phase 1. This is an epic. We had a design for the reports, and the description is simple. It says we will be covering minimum viable product, and then the actual detailed one pager is linked here. And then I don't have it in the screenshot, but it had like an end date and due date, all of that. Again, this was something that had to be done before the semester. So this one had a hard deadline, and it was baked into all the epics that were designed. So larger body of work, multiple user stories, and start and end date. That's epic for you. A project is a little bit of a misnomer. Usually, outside of software development and work, a project is something that starts and finishes. But typically in software management or software development or project management software like Jira and Trello and whatnot, a project is usually like an initiative that does not finish. Like app could be a project that does not really finish. I don't know how or the history of why this nomenclature, naming convention came to be. But usually when you say project, it describes something that is like ongoing and continuous and not something that starts and finishes. And again, Basecamp is one notable example where you could have a project that can finish, but most of the other tools call a responsibility or initiative as a project. It's a team level thing. A project is always owned by a team and technically it doesn't end, right? So that's project as applicable to Jira or other project management team. Now sprint, again, sprint is a beautiful cadence mechanism and it's an excellent planning tool. Has a start date, has an end date, and typically is 1 to 2 weeks. Everybody's really well familiar with sprints. In CoLearn, for example, our sprints started on Monday and ended on the next Wednesday. And then the Thursday and Friday after that were free. The Thursday was actually free for people to do what they want. And the Friday was reserved for sprint ceremonies like retro and all that. So technically people got like around 1 and a half days of free unrestricted time. And then half day of sprint ceremonies. And the rest of the one was like sprint work. Now sprint again is not a release mechanism. Never back yourself into a corner saying I will release 10 user points in this sprint and then go and do that. Sprint is supposed to represent a cadence and not a release cycle. Slightly controversial. Not everybody does it that way. My recommendation is anyway, right? So I don't want to go into details about what sprints are. But my recommendation is that don't use sprint as a release mechanism. As far as possible, you have a continuous deployment process and then use sprint as a cadence and planning tool so that you have to meaningfully talk about work every now and then. You have to discuss with your team how much work is going to happen or what are we doing, what exactly is happening, where things are the metrics matching up to the work we're doing, all of those things. And sprints give you that cadence to repeatedly talk about these things. Repeatedly look back and make mistakes or fix mistakes, etc. But sprints are not, oh, let's plan to release these 10 things in this sprint, and and then if they're not done by Friday, then you work on a weekend and finish. That's a terrible way of working. Right? I don't subscribe to it. I don't recommend it. Teams that enforce it are in for a shockingly bad time. Without realizing, etc. So there are lots of problems associated with that. This talk is not about sprints and not about engineering culture. This talk is about project management. So let me move over. So let's say you're saying, okay, Swanand, I see what you're saying. I like the principles. I like your practical whatever. But I already have a project and it's a mess. Now, how do I get out of this mess? What do I do? I have a couple of suggestions for you. If you already have a project, the best thing to do and the best place to start is capture all the work that has not been captured yet, right? So that's the first place. Go back to first principle. Principle number 1, capture all the work that has not been captured and put it somewhere, right? Now, once you have it somewhere, next thing to do is create epics with tentative dates. Create all the epics, categorize all the captured and uncaptured or previously uncaptured work into finishable pieces of work. Name them epics, give them dates, and organize it. This is a one-time activity that can be fairly time-consuming, but I recommend the leaders, engineering managers, product managers, or anybody above in the pecking order to spend time doing this, capturing all the uncaptured work, and then categorizing it in terms of epics. And then have about 3 upcoming sprints sort of filled with work that you've just categorized, right? 3 sprints is like roughly 1 to 1.5 months. That gives you enough time to actually implement a more systematic approach to work, and then come back and review that and see if this is working for you, not working, what changes you want to do. So up to 3 upcoming sprints. When you do this, then the teams are free to go and start pushing the work out, etc. Gives you like enough cadence to get the work done, and also come back and talk about the work retro and then fix course correct. So that's my recommendation. You start here, and then you will untangle your project management in no time, provided you are following the 6 principles that we spoke about earlier in this fashion. So what if you don't have a project? If you're starting from scratch, well, the thing is the recommendation does not change. If you're starting from scratch, capture all the work that has not been captured, and that means almost all the work. Create a pitch with tentative dates, categorize them into finishing pieces of work, and then have about 3 upcoming sprints of worth of work lined up. Same exact method, whether you have a project that is messy or a project that is you're starting from scratch, same thing applies. This is what you do at the start of a more systematic approach to project management. This connects back to track all the work, start with 4 list, and write to our top 3 principles. Right. There are a couple of other things I want to quickly talk about. I know we are sort of a little bit over time, but I think if it's useful, I'll continue. If everyone is bored, I'll stop.
I think yeah, we can go for some more time maybe.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right.
Go for another
All
10
right.
minutes or so.
All right. So labels are extremely powerful. One of the most underused feature of any system, including like Gmail, is labels. They are super flexible. They are searchable, and almost every single tool, work management tool or associated tools, they support labels. And here's the other thing: labels are the only mechanism with which you can horizontal and vertical categorization is possible at the same time. You can categorize something horizontally, like based on one product or pertaining to a product or business line, or you can categorize it horizontally, like based on functional lines like design, etc. Labels are the only things that can actually help you categorize. Anything else, you need a hierarchy, and hierarchies are terrible at categorization because it's very difficult to maintain them. Then there's a lot of friction. Use labels powerfully, right? Once you start with some labels, let them evolve over time, and then you will start to see patterns and stuff. In the beginning, if you are labeling, just be unrestricted with your labels. Over time, you can clean and prune them, but super powerful. The mental model you want to always remember with label is your horizontal and vertical categorization at the same time, and it's only possible with labels. The thing is, when it comes to information architecture, you are worse than you think you are. Like you think, oh, I know how to organize my data. I know how to organize my Google Drive. I will use the para method to organize. I have second brain, whatnot. The thing is, you are worse than you think you are. Information architecture is an immensely hard problem, and it's very difficult for humans to truly appreciate how hard it can be. And there are different types of frictions. There's a friction to enter data, there's a friction to search data, there's a friction to read data, etc. There's lots of different levels of complexities associated, and no one system can actually offer a solution that works for everything. But we tend to think we do. And so don't do that. Don't try to obsessively categorize everything. Labels and searchability will give you more than anything else you can. And now swim lanes, every product manager's favorite tool is a swim lane. Unfortunately, I don't have a screenshot for a swim lane. I think I don't have access to the CoLearn Jira board anymore. What I can do is I can ask some of my old colleagues to send me a screenshot and I'll share it with the group. But basically, vertically, you want to divide a group. Generally, a swim lane is like a single level of responsibility. If you're looking at a Jira board, for example, or a Kanban board, you could create swim lanes with the epics. That means like all the work about that epics is presented in one horizontal line, and then the next epic is on the next line, etc. So that's swim lanes. Again, they're a very strong tool for for leaders. When you are reviewing your work, you can try different swim lanes. Like you can create a swim lane by epic and then review all the work under that epic. You can create a swim lane by assignee and then look at what people are doing. You can create swim lanes by label, again, possible in Jira, company managed project. So all of that, when you routinely review your board, trying out different swim lanes and reviewing the board using different swim lanes is a powerful technique. Leadership must get good at swim lanes, right? It's a no-brainer, and it's a strong organization tool or strong review tool. So if you're an IC, it's okay. You don't have to worry about swim lanes so much. But if you're a PM or any kind of leadership position, you must get good at swim lanes. Now a little bit of talk about process. If you want to start organizing your work from like an amorphous mass of unplanned work to plan. Always think in terms of roadmap, like what are we doing in, let's say, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, and then again break it down to epics, and then break it down to user stories, then use sprints to drive the cadence, right? You want a sprint to have a meaningful cadence meetings to deliver work. And so it's basically long term to short term. You always want to work from long term to short term. Like there's a certain advantage in working from long to short. It prevents you from short sightedness and groupthink and all those things. You can align like metrics and KPIs and key result areas much easier if you're working on long term first. It's not difficult to see that let's say one team owns a certain metric, then a roadmap gives you the long-term evolution of that particular metric, and then coming down to epics gives you the short-term evolution of that metric, etc. And so I always prefer this style of organizing work in the beginning, and then use the sprints to drive that cadence. Again, like sprints are a cadence mechanism, not a release mechanism. I spoke a little bit about that earlier. Same thing, use them for cadence, not to commit yourself into pushing like 10 cards out per sprint or something like that, right? Everyday operations, connecting back to 6 principles, you want to optimize for the left to right movements of card. That means like you don't want cards cluttering your board. And if you keep looking at the same card every day when you review, that card tends to become invisible to you, right? It's like human beings notice things that move around. In a jungle, if a tiger or a predator is completely still, it's very hard to notice. But if they move, you can actually see them. Similar principle, things that move stay in our attention, things that are stationary fall out of our attention. So you want to optimize the movement of cards from left to right. A card that is too big is not going to move fast enough, and too many small cards, they overwhelm and drown the team with volume. You don't want to do that. That's why 1 to 2 days. Priority must be visually clear. I spoke about that a little bit. I'm just revising it here. Keep the to-do columns sorted by priority, top to bottom. Topmost is the most important thing, and likewise. And then revisit your backlog once a month. Always there's going to be work that you're going to tempted to, okay, let's just do this later and whatnot. Put it in the backlog and review it once a month. Anything more than once a month is like too much, and anything less than once a month means you'll forget about it. So once a month is like a reasonably good thumb rule for backlog verification, a backlog revisit. Just connecting back to 6 principles, like all the work, start with 4 lists, work from right to left, top to bottom, 1 to 2 day work chunks, focus on why, context, and then finally describe the finish line, not the route. That's it. Thank you.
Hey, there are a few questions.
Yes, I can stop presenting and then maybe take a few questions.
So how to handle frequent changes in the middle of a sprint?
How to handle frequent changes in the middle of sprint? Again, it's a little bit of a political question, but whoever asked it, can you give an example of what one such change? By the way, I see Sandhya Mohandas is on the chat. One of the tasks that I showed that had SM on it, that's her.
Yeah.
That SM that you saw, that's Sandhya. Hey, Sandy.
Hey.
All right. So yeah, the whoever asked about the changes, can you share like what changes are you talking about? Okay, I need to determine if you're talking about political. Again, the question is political or is it like a process question?
Not sure. Maybe they might have dropped off. It's possible.
Okay.
So maybe we can.
Oh, there's a Q&A. I see. There's a whole bunch of questions. Okay.
Although I didn't ask, but it can be anything. It can be bugs. It can be maybe an immediate urgent request from the sales team because there's a bigger clip.
Okay, cool. All right. So from a process perspective, yeah, I think Pulkita, I think I sort of understood probably what the question was. So from a process perspective, you always want to keep it top to bottom sorted, right? So when the team finishes their current piece of work and moves on to the next piece of work, they need to pick something from the top. This is sort of something that team needs to agree on. Now, what goes on to top, that part is up to the leaders. Sometimes the team has a completely async process that, hey, the engineering manager will say, okay, I put this on the top, and they'll let the team know, hey, something urgent has come up and I'm pushing scope up and whatnot. logically speaking, if you are, let's say, adding like a 2-day work at the top of the pile, you can take something out from the bottom, or just let it roll over into next sprint. But this whole change of priority is again a very cultural and political thing. Some teams are okay, or some leaders are okay just mandating things to the team. Hey, you know what, this is a priority, and then they can back it up by saying this came up, this is the impact of doing it, and this is the impact of not doing it, and then we are choosing to do it at the moment. And so as long as there is like enough transparency between the team, it generally works out. But if the leadership is not aligned and they're just adding work on top of other work, then you have to make them clear that there's only so much a team can do in a particular span of time. You cannot just magically work more hours. You cannot magically do more things. There is limits to how much you can do. And so that part should be established and clear in the team, right? Sometimes obviously there are like genuine priorities. Maybe they was doing like the team was doing a sales experiment and did not work, or did not work as anticipated. Something else happened and they want to change. So changing priorities are actually quite common. Even in grocery shopping, like you wanted to buy bread, you even know like which brand of bread you buy, but then you ran across a bakery that was like selling fresh sourdough, then you just change and you bought that instead, etc. Right? So that's a simple example. As long as there is a agreement within the team of how to handle that, I don't see a problem. But like I said, if people are piling up work, then that's a cultural or a political problem, and it needs a different handling. Okay, Siddharth asked, sorry, before I go to Siddharth's question, Pulkit, do you feel like I've answered your question, or not really?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe taking out something out of the pile when you're putting up things is an action.
I mean, we have to be reasonable, right? We are working with humans and we are not working with workers. Employees are humans and they are not workers. They are not machines that are just churning out code and whatnot. You have to understand that as a leader. And so if you're if you're giving something or adding something, then you want to consider taking something away to maintain consistency, sustainability, all of those things, right? So if you keep humans, like let's say the business metrics and humans both in mind, then it's easy to come up with something that can work for both. Okay, cool. I'm going to move to Siddharth's question. He asks, Jira has 2 modes of operation, Kanban and Scrum. I think you have fluidly used both. Does it matter how we use Jira in the context of? Yeah, honestly, it doesn't matter. I tend to go with the Scrum board because it gives you sprints, but I use it in a Kanban fashion. But if you only pick the Kanban board, ultimately, if you enable backlog and sprint and reporting, they are the same thing. So the only difference in Kanban and Scrum is just the starting point, and so you can pick whatever you want. What you do want is like sprints are useful to drive the cadence. So I want to make sure that there's at least some level of or some way to handle cadence in Kanban. Trello, for example, does not have a concept of sprints. So if you're doing a pure Kanban, then in Trello, what happens is you have the done column. It gets filled up, then you have to rename like done on by, let's say, July end. And then you archive that column and then move on. So different styles have different methods of handling the same thing. But these 6 principles are applicable in both. And you can do in either of them. Cool.
Okay, if anybody wants to continue discussion and Swanand is also available, maybe you can continue. Unfortunately, I need to drop off. I have to go get somewhere.
All right.
But thanks Swanand for the talk. Thanks everybody for attending. And yeah, feel free to sort of continue the conversation if
Great. All right. Thanks,
there's
Shiva.
interest. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Cool. So if anybody else, anything else?
Swanand, hi, this is Anuj. Hi,
Go for it.
I had a question, like based on your experience, like what do you suggest about granularity of tasks? Like for example, let's say I'm working on a feature which has both front end and back end involved, right? And so based on your experience, like what works, like how much granular should I go? Like I want to export certain API endpoints, create a task for that, create a subtask for that, or handle auth, create a subtask for that. Like how much granular should I go, and like, or should I just keep it at the product requirement level?
Yeah, good question. So backend and front end again is a source of contention. And it sort of a little bit goes against the principle of keeping everything user focused. So I think of backend and frontend as front-end teams are in charge of the user experience because they directly work on things that users are using. So I look at front-end teams as being in charge of the user experience, and then the front-end teams are the users for the backend team, roughly speaking, right? So if you create a separation like domain APIs, backend team provides domain APIs, and front-end team uses the domain APIs to build something, craft a user experience. And so that's how I generally structure the user stories that I work on. But the granularity is like if you want to create like an API endpoint, and generally speaking, one API endpoint per card is the sort of standard that is easiest to follow. Sometimes you would want something like delete. So or like login, for example, is a good is an example. Login can be like a multi-factor. So if you have multi-factor login, then you have multiple endpoints in that same card. But it doesn't make sense to separate them out because it's one single experience. And so you could choose to keep them together. But sometimes you want to test out like, okay, I logged in with the password and then I was presented with the two-factor authentication screen. And then that can, if your team is comfortable like that as an independently verifiable piece of work, then you can choose to keep that as a single user story. So what I'm saying is that there's a lot of judgment calls involved here. But the core principle is keeping it like say 1 to 2 days, and as long as it is independently verifiable, I think you will be good.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. All right, Nishant.
Hey.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
How do you balance tasks, like say, which improve developer experience and tasks which improve user experience? So user stories are like tasks which, or the things that you can do that improve user experience, right? Either a bug or a feature.
Yeah.
But sometimes occasionally you also want to do tasks which improve developer productivity. So how do you go about as a leader balancing both?
Again, like that's a pretty good question, and it's actually a commonly faced dilemma for many teams. You want to improve the test suite runtime by, let's say, 10-20%. That's going to improve the experience of everybody, but you're slammed with work. This is why generally I have that Thursday free day to do these kind of things. Like my sprints start like Monday and Wednesday, and then there's a little bit of free time for that. Here's the thing: developer experience again is important, and if the team agrees that we want to spend, let's say, 20% time on developer experience and whatnot, or anything that the team feels important, you can do that. For any team to work on something meaningful and be in a place where they can innovate, they can address tech debt, there needs to be a little bit slack in the system, right? If everybody is held very tightly and they're constantly delivering on the production line, that's a recipe for burnout. And people optimize for wrong things when you hold the team very tightly. So you want a little bit of slack in the system. You want like 10% free time, 15% free time. And then somebody, let's say you care about the DX a lot. Another person does not care about it so much. They want to like do something else, right? So everybody should have the freedom to pursue what they want in that slack period. So in the teams that I have worked with and I consult with and I have run, I keep that 10-20% time to account for these kind of things. Some of the other patterns that I've seen is you add the developer experience as a part of the board, create a task, and then prioritize, and then debate the priority of that during planning meetings, right? You say, okay, this is important right now. If you don't improve the test suite right now, it's going to get out of hand pretty fast, and then we'll not be able to roll out some of the things that matter to the business, and you bring it up, right? And so that is another pattern of just adding it as a part of regular work and then debating and putting the priority based on what the team feels. And then the second is to always have a little of slack in the system to account for people's individual preferences, right? So these are the two most effective strategies that I have used and seen used that work.
I have follow-up questions if I may ask. Okay. How did you exploratory work? Like sometimes there's a new tech or a new library or a replacement library that comes out that may be beneficial for your product, but you'd have to explore to determine. Like, do you typically do that in the Slack time that you just mentioned, or do you do that in your own personal time?
I do mix of all three. I sometimes do it as a part of the work, sometimes do it as a part of the Slack or the free time, sometimes do it as a part of personal work, etc. Exploration is a core part of engineering, right? Like engineers, developers need to keep exploring. Like for example, if you don't, the person who wrote Redux, right? If they had not explored these things, they would have never written Redux in the first place. And Redux ended up changing like how industry looks at state management, etc. Right? So, and again, that's an example of a very highly ambitious project. But what I'm saying is like, if you don't have that mentality of okay, I'll go do it, I'll have like a leisurely pursuit, I'm doing my work, etc. It's very hard to always manage and do everything deliberately. Some things have to happen organically, right? So I don't really impose rules on myself that this is how I'm going to do, right? So what I do is like I look at what feels organic, and I look at like what the team is behaving and the metrics and whatnot, and then I just decide. Does it make sense? Yeah.
Sort of, yeah. Thank you.
All right. Atish, do you want to ask?
Yes. So typically, while designing system, our core mentality is to keep the server smart and client dumb. But typically, in real-time scenarios, it might not work that way always. So there is always a potential of a conflict in team, whether this should be done on the front end or on the back end. So in such scenarios, as a leader, how do you resolve such conflicts?
The first thing to recognize is that backend teams and front-end teams always move at different speeds and for different reasons. In some cases, the domain itself might be really complex. Like if you're doing like something like finance and compliance, then there's a lot of work on the backend that needs to happen, and then the front end might be moving at a different pace. Sometimes front ends, teams are building apps and whatnot. Front ends are notoriously hard to test, right? It's difficult to test like an admin dashboard or a Excel sheet kind of thing. You have to have some level of manual testing, etc. So the first thing to really recognize is that the teams move at different speeds, and they have different level of verifiability, different level of accountability in the work, and then accordingly balance it out. Now the actual question about whether to keep the logic on the server and or client, that honestly is like super context dependent, and I would leave it to like the tech leads and the EMs and everybody in the team to make that decision. Usually, if you control the distribution mechanism, then you can have a good balance. Like if it's a front-end web app, you know that every time user refreshes, you're going to get a new app, and then you can have a good balance of front-end and back-end. But if you're building the app, for example, and you know that you cannot release to the app so when and when you want, you're left to the mercy of Apple or Google, then you don't want to keep the app so heavy. You should always have control over the distribution of your software. And so this decision about keeping where to keep the logic is always tied to the distribution of the software.
Okay. Thanks, sir.
Cool. Shivan, go ahead. I think you raised hand a couple of times. Go ahead.
Yeah, you can hear me, right?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. So this is regarding the this is somewhat to do with the process that you spoke about, especially with regards to the whole ping pong effect. Not really pointing out to people and basically taking ownership of your work, right? So I kind of most parts I kind of align with that, saying that product teams or like engineers essentially start ending up your own features, like owning up your own features, right? So in this case, does it mean that it, at least for the front end piece of work, it most likely will not go to the whole manual testing lane, or your testers do not end up taking ownership of that piece of work? Or if it is that case, will the whole manual testing process eventually just fade out of the blue for front end teams?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I think if Kamakshi is still around, I think this could be a good debate of how much do we include like the ping pong between QA, product, and engineering. The fact is that there is no one clear answer. Right? Sometimes the context really demands that you need to let the control over to the QA team. Right? There are some things that developers are famously not great at testing, corner case testing, right? Something I think Kamakshi and I have spoken in depth before also, right? Yeah, so corner case testing, for example, is very difficult to do, in code and as a part of everyday workflow. So in those kind of cases, you want to yield the control to the QA team, because they're going to do a far better job and they're going to deliver a user experience far better than what you can do. And so that again is a super contextual discussion between like what the team is, team composition, etc. Sometimes it's a question of bandwidth, right? Hey, maybe there's only two QAs and they are fully slammed with work. Who's going to do the work? So it's very
I think he'll join back. I hope so.
Yeah, I think we lost him. I think Swanand's battery kind of died, so he's just joining back. I pinged him. So, who's the host for this meeting? I think he's trying to join, but then he's unable to join back. No idea.
I think Siva would have assigned somebody to CoLearn, but yeah, no idea.
I think he's trying to join, but he's unable to join. So he's asking if anybody is having any more doubts. Probably he's asking if we can do a tweet or an email to him. Possibly I can share his email ID in the chat. Yeah, I've just dropped his email ID so that either you can just tweet him or drop him an email. So he just asked me to convey this.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. Thanks,
Thanks
everyone.
everyone. See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.